Sheriff Logan Matthews leaned back in his chair, savoring the rare peace of a quiet Saturday morning. His home, a rustic retreat on the edge of redwood pines, sat just beyond the grasp of the HOA, a fact he took pride in. With a steaming cup of black coffee in hand, he exhaled, letting the crisp autumn air fill his lungs. For once, there were no phone calls, no emergencies, no bureaucratic nonsense, just silence. Then, screech! The violent screech of tires shredded through the morning calm, followed by a loud, gut-wrenching bang. Logan shot upright, his instincts kicking in before he even set his mug down. A split second later, his front gate rattled as Mason Brooks, his hot-headed but reliable neighbor, stormed up the steps, his face twisted in fury. "They've lost their bloody minds, Logan," Mason spat, chest heaving. Logan narrowed his eyes. "Who?" "The damn HOA." Mason jabbed a finger toward the road. "They just laid down bloody spike strips." Logan blinked, momentarily stunned. "Come again?" Mason threw his hands up. "They put spike strips across the main road, the public one. Said it's to control reckless drivers. But that's county land, Logan. They've got no right." A slow, cold anger settled in Logan's chest. "Show me." Grabbing his keys, he followed Mason outside, a dark suspicion already forming. Something was seriously wrong. Sheriff Logan Matthews gritted his teeth as he gripped the steering wheel, his truck roaring down the winding road leading into redwood pines. The morning sun glared against his windshield, but his mind was already burning hotter. Spike strips? On a public road? This wasn't just some overreach, it was an outright power grab. As he approached the entrance to the neighborhood, his gut twisted. There they were, gleaming rows of metal teeth embedded into the asphalt, positioned like a trap waiting to spring. And standing next to them, arms folded with an air of smug authority, was none other than Gavin Ross, the self-important HOA enforcer. Logan rolled down his window, forcing a neutral expression. "Morning, Gavin. What's going on here?" Gavin smirked, barely suppressing his glee. "Ah, Sheriff Matthews, just implementing the HOA's new safety measure. Keeps out reckless drivers and," he gestured vaguely, "unwanted visitors." Logan's fingers tightened around the wheel. "This isn't HOA property, Gavin. This is a county-maintained road. You don't have the authority to do this." Gavin shrugged. "The HOA board disagrees. If you've got a problem, take it up with them." Before Logan could reply, the sound of an approaching car caught his attention. A silver sedan. Driver, unaware. Heading straight for the spikes. "Hey, stop!" Logan barked, throwing open his door and waving his arms. Too late. Pop, pop! The sickening sound of tires exploding filled the air as the sedan lurched forward, then swerved violently to a stop. The driver, a man in a crisp button-down shirt, stumbled out, face contorted in pure disbelief. "You have got to be kidding me," he shouted, storming toward the spikes. "What the hell is this?" Gavin, unfazed, flipped open a clipboard as if he were some kind of border agent. "New HOA rule. All unregistered vehicles must stop for inspection before entering." "Inspection?" The driver's voice rose. "I live here." Gavin didn't even glance up. "Then you should have registered your car with the HOA." Logan stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "Gavin, you just caused $2,000 in damages. This is illegal." Gavin chuckled. "No, it's not. The HOA board approved it." Logan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He could already see it. Lawsuits, insurance claims, news crews swarming the place. And these morons had no idea who they were messing with. He tilted his head, eyes locked onto Gavin's. "How do you control the spikes?" Gavin smirked, tapping his pocket. "Remote access. Only HOA security can disable them. Keeps the riffraff out." The man with the shredded tires stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You're telling me I have to pay for new tires because of your ridiculous rules?" Gavin shrugged. "You can file a complaint with the board." Logan had seen enough. This wasn't just HOA overreach. This was extortion. And they were going down. What do you think? Should HOA have the power to control public roads? Comment outrageous if you think this is unacceptable, or type HOA rules if you support their actions. And don't miss what happens next. Sheriff Logan is about to uncover something far worse than just spike strips. Like, comment, and subscribe to stay tuned. Would you fight back against an HOA like this? Drop your thoughts below. Sheriff Logan Matthews let out a slow breath, his patience hanging by a thread. He glanced at the stranded driver, then back at Gavin Ross, who stood there like he was the king of Redwood Pines, arms crossed, exuding arrogance. "You do realize," Logan said, his voice level but firm, "that disabling a vehicle like this is a crime, right?" Gavin smirked, completely unbothered. "Not according to the HOA." Logan's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about power-hungry HOA board members anymore. This was reckless endangerment. The driver of the silver sedan, still fuming, stepped forward. "So what? You expect me to pay for the damage your little stunt caused?" Gavin shrugged. "That's between you and your insurance company." Logan could feel the anger rolling off the man in waves, his hands clenching into fists. He wasn't the only one. Across the street, a few other residents had started to gather, whispering amongst themselves, watching the scene unfold. The tension in the air was thick, and it was only a matter of time before someone snapped. Logan turned his gaze back to the spikes embedded in the road, assessing them carefully. They weren't simple, manual strips like law enforcement used for high-speed chases. These were mechanically controlled, remotely operated, designed to retract and deploy at the push of a button. His eyes flickered to Gavin's pocket. That remote was the key. "So let me get this straight," Logan said, stepping closer, his presence imposing. "You're telling me the HOA, which has no jurisdiction over this road, installed a remote-controlled spike system to stop vehicles from entering?" Gavin's smirk widened. "Exactly. Keeps things orderly." Logan's expression darkened. "And who gets to decide who can and can't pass?" Gavin tapped his clipboard. "Only approved HOA members." Logan's stomach twisted. This wasn't about safety. This was control. The driver of the sedan let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're telling me I need permission to drive to my own house?" "No sticker, no entry," Gavin replied flatly. At that moment, a blue minivan approached from the other direction, slowing as the driver caught sight of the wrecked sedan. Logan watched closely. The minivan had a small HOA sticker on the windshield. Gavin pulled the remote from his pocket, pressed a button, and, just like that, the spikes retracted into the pavement. The minivan rolled through smoothly. But the moment it passed, the spikes popped right back up. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Logan clenched his jaw. There it was. The proof. This wasn't about reckless driving. It wasn't about safety. This was HOA-sanctioned extortion. Gavin turned back to Logan, clearly reveling in his power. "Unless you're an HOA member, Sheriff, your opinion doesn't matter." Logan exhaled slowly, stepping back toward his truck. Gavin thought he'd won. He had no idea what was coming next. Sheriff Logan Matthews pulled into his station, his mind already racing. This wasn't just HOA overreach, it was a full-blown scam. The spike strips weren't for safety. They were a way to control, intimidate, and exploit residents. And worse? The HOA was doing it on county land, territory they had absolutely no legal claim over. He slammed the truck door shut and strode into his office, the sound of his boots echoing off the floor. His gut told him this went deeper than a few power-hungry board members. He needed proof, and he needed it fast. Logan sat down at his desk and fired up his computer, pulling up the county's property records. Within seconds, the truth was staring him right in the face. The road leading into Redwood Pines was 100% county-maintained. That meant Gavin Ross and his HOA lackeys had zero authority to block access, let alone cause thousands of dollars in vehicle damage. But that wasn't the worst of it. Logan kept digging, searching for any past complaints against the HOA. What he found made his stomach turn. Multiple reports from residents claiming they'd been fined thousands of dollars for trivial violations. Mailboxes the wrong color, lawns too dry, fences 2 inches too high. Threats of foreclosure against elderly homeowners who couldn't afford the arbitrary fees. Illegally towed vehicles, even when residents were parked in their own driveways. And then, he found it. A recent complaint from a homeowner who had secretly recorded an HOA meeting. In the transcript, HOA President Margaret Delacroix was discussing the spike strips and how they could be used as a tool to weed out the undesirables from the neighborhood. Logan felt his hands tighten into fists. This wasn't incompetence, this was a racket. With a sharp breath, he picked up his phone and dialed the county commissioner. "Doug, it's Logan. I need you to confirm something for me." The voice on the other end let out a chuckle, Let me guess, Redwood Pines? Logan's eyes narrowed. Yeah, they're claiming the entrance road belongs to the HOA, Doug scoffed. They've been trying that for years. It's county property, Logan. They have no right to touch it. Logan's lips curled into a cold smirk. Good, because they just installed spike strips and are charging residents to enter. There was silence, then a low whistle. That's felony territory, mate. Logan nodded. Yeah, and I plan to shut it down by sunrise. He hung up and immediately dialed his deputies. Meet me at Redwood Pines first thing in the morning, he ordered. We're taking those bastards down. This wasn't just about HOA greed anymore. This was criminal, and Logan was about to put an end to it. Sheriff Logan Matthews leaned against his desk, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a storm cloud ready to burst. He had all the evidence he needed. County records proving the road wasn't HOA property, resident complaints exposing their corruption, and now confirmation from the commissioner himself. But knowing the truth and delivering justice were two very different things. He checked his watch. 4:30 a.m. By the time the sun rose over Redwood Pines, he would have every single piece of this scheme dismantled. Logan grabbed his radio. All units, meet at the Redwood Pines entrance in 1 hour. We're shutting this down. The response was immediate. Copy that, Sheriff. By the time Logan pulled into the neighborhood, the early morning fog was still rolling across the pavement, clinging to the eerie silence. But he wasn't alone. 3 squad cars followed behind him, red and blue lights flashing ominously, illuminating the front gates of the community. His deputies, hands resting near their holsters, stepped out in unison, their presence impossible to ignore. And standing there, gripping a half-empty coffee cup, was Gavin Ross. The moment he spotted the convoy of law enforcement, his eyes widened, his mouth slightly agape. He was caught completely off guard. Logan didn't waste time. He stepped forward, his badge glinting in the dawn light. Morning, Gavin, he said coolly. Gavin swallowed hard, quickly composing himself. Sheriff, what's with the… You're under investigation for illegal road obstruction, willful property damage, and extortion. The color drained from Gavin's face. Behind him, the HOA president, Margaret Delacroix, came storming out of her house, still in her robe, her hair an unkempt mess. This is a misunderstanding, she shrieked, shoving her way past the officers. We were simply enforcing community rules. Logan didn't even flinch. He pulled out his tablet, tapped the screen, and hit play. On the screen, security footage rolled. A grainy night vision video showing Gavin sneaking out at midnight, resetting the spike strips, and carefully checking a list of approved vehicles. It was undeniable proof that this wasn't about safety. This was a racket. Margaret paled. You knew, Logan said, his voice steady. You knew this road wasn't HOA property, and you did it anyway. Gavin opened his mouth to argue, right as one of Logan's deputies grabbed his wrist and snapped handcuffs around them. The sound of the metal locking into place was deafening. You have the right to remain silent, the deputy began. Residents started to emerge from their homes, drawn by the flashing lights. Whispers turned to murmurs. Murmurs to outright shouting as realization set in. The HOA had been caught, and this time, there was no escaping it. Margaret Delacroix's face twisted with panic as the reality of the situation sank in. The HOA's reign over Redwood Pines was crumbling, and she knew it. The flashing police lights painted her pale features in streaks of red and blue as she stammered, eyes darting between Gavin Ross, now in handcuffs, and Sheriff Logan Matthews, who stood firm like an immovable wall. This is insane, she spat, her voice laced with desperation. We were only trying to maintain the integrity of our neighborhood. Sheriff, surely you see… Logan's cold stare cut her off. What I see, he said, voice steady, is an HOA that thought they were above the law. Margaret opened her mouth again, but this time the crowd had had enough. A man in his 50s, Daniel Reed, shoved forward, his face red with anger. You used our money for this? While people in this neighborhood are struggling to pay your endless fines? A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering residents. Another voice, this one belonging to Lena Carter, a single mother who had been threatened with foreclosure over a missing garden gnome, spoke up. You told me I'd lose my house if I didn't pay your bogus landscaping fees, and now I find out you've been stealing from us. Margaret's eyes darted around, searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. Logan stepped closer. We pulled the HOA's financial records, he said, keeping his voice just loud enough for the entire street to hear. You spent over $250,000 of resident funds in the last year alone, and not on maintenance, not on improvements, on enforcing illegal rules. The crowd erupted, shouts of "thieves" and "you'll pay for this" filled the air as Margaret shrank back, suddenly aware of how outnumbered she was. Gavin, still handcuffed, let out a dry, bitter laugh. "You're done, Margaret," he muttered. "You always thought you were untouchable. Guess not," Margaret snapped. She whirled on Gavin, her composure finally shattering. "You think you're innocent in this? You were the one running the extortion racket. I told you the spike strips were going too far," Gavin sneered. "Oh, please. You approved them. You just thought no one would catch you." Logan watched as the two turned on each other, the last remnants of their pathetic empire falling apart before his eyes. Then, he raised a hand. Silence fell over the street. "This is over," he announced, his voice carrying above the crowd. "By the time the sun sets, the HOA will be shut down. There will be an audit of all fines and fees collected under this corruption. And anyone who's been a victim of this extortion, you will get justice." A roar of approval surged through the residents. Margaret's shoulders slumped, her once pristine reputation in shambles. And as Logan watched his deputies load Gavin into the back of a squad car, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Redwood Pines was finally free. As the sun climbed higher over Redwood Pines, the scene outside the gated community had transformed into absolute chaos. News vans lined the street, cameras rolling as reporters swarmed the residents, eager to capture the unraveling of the most corrupt HOA scandal the town had ever seen. Sheriff Logan Matthews stood in the center of it all, arms crossed, watching as justice took its course. Margaret Delacroix sat slumped on the curb, her perfectly manicured hands clutching her forehead. The once feared HOA president was now nothing more than a disgraced fraud, exposed for the entire community to see. Her empire, built on intimidation and greed, had collapsed in a single morning. A few feet away, Gavin Ross was being shoved into the back of a squad car, his face twisted in a mix of anger and disbelief. He had spent years abusing his tiny scrap of power, lording over homeowners like he was some kind of dictator. Now, he was just another criminal with a long list of charges to answer for. The residents, however, were anything but quiet. "This is what our HOA fees were paying for," one man shouted, waving a stack of unpaid citations in the air. A woman in a business suit, her face still red with anger, turned to Logan. "Sheriff, what happens now?" Logan exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. "The HOA board is being dissolved immediately," he said, his voice firm. "Every single fine, every illegal charge, every foreclosure threat they made will be investigated. No one is losing their home over this scam." A collective cheer erupted. But Logan wasn't done yet. He turned toward the news cameras, letting them get a good look at the pile of confiscated documents his deputies had retrieved from the HOA's office. "This wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood," he said, his voice steady but cutting. "It was about greed. It was about power. And it stops today." More applause. A few residents even began tearing down the HOA's official sign, the symbol of an organization that had tormented them for far too long. Logan glanced over at Margaret. She was staring blankly at the scene before her, watching her legacy turn to dust. And he didn't feel the slightest bit sorry for her. Across the street, Daniel Reed, one of the longest-standing residents, approached Logan with a smirk. "You know, Sheriff," he said, "we've been thinking about renaming this road." Logan raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah?" Daniel grinned. "Something fitting. Maybe Matthews Way?" Logan chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't need my name on a street," Daniel shrugged. "Fine. How about a sign at the entrance? Something simple. No HOA allowed." The entire crowd erupted in laughter and cheers. For the first time in years, Redwood Pines belonged to the people again. And Logan? He was just glad he had given them their freedom back. As the dust settled over Redwood Pines, the once feared HOA board was nothing but a bitter memory. Margaret Delacroix had been escorted away, her reign of intimidation crumbling in front of the very people she had exploited for years. Gavin Ross, still fuming, sat in the back of a squad car, his arrogance now replaced with the grim realization that his power trip had come to an end. Sheriff Logan Matthews stood by his truck, arms crossed, taking in the sight of the community reclaiming their neighborhood. The once manicured streets, which had been policed by ridiculous HOA fines and endless restrictions, now felt open, free. Residents were already at work, ripping down the HOA's official signage, tossing HOA rulebooks into trash bins, and pulling out the last remnants of their forced regulations. The community had won. But Logan knew that justice didn't stop here. He had already spoken with the county commissioner about launching a full-scale audit of HOA funds. Every single resident who had been unfairly fined, harassed, or threatened with foreclosure would get their money back. Those who had lost property due to HOA corruption, their cases would be reopened. Across the street, Daniel Reed, one of the oldest homeowners in Redwood Pines, approached Logan again, this time with a beer in hand. "Well, Sheriff, you did it," he said, offering a toast. "First time in a long while that this place actually belongs to the people again." Logan took the beer, but he shook his head. "You all did this. I just made sure the law was followed." Daniel smirked. "Sure, Sheriff. Whatever helps you sleep at night." The residents burst into laughter, a sound that hadn't been heard in years, the sound of a true community, no longer under the HOA's thumb. As the sun began to set, a few people gathered around a wooden post where the HOA's sign had once stood. Someone had already nailed up a new sign, hand-painted but bold. Logan chuckled, tipping his hat slightly. Redwood Pines had finally found its freedom, and no self-important HOA was ever going to take it away again. What would you do if an HOA tried to take control of your neighborhood like this? Would you fight back like Sheriff Logan, or would you have handled it differently? Drop a comment below and tell us, was Sheriff Logan right to shut them down? Do you think more neighborhoods should fight back against overreaching HOAs? And here's a big question. What should Logan do next? Should he launch a statewide crackdown on corrupt HOAs? Should he help other communities take back control? Hit the like button if you think Logan did the right thing, and share this story with someone who hates HOA nonsense as much as you do. This fight isn't over, and you can be part of the movement.